The dusty fairground buzzed with excitement as families wandered between colorful booths and carnival rides. Children clutched cotton candy while their parents tried their luck at ring toss and balloon darts. The summer heat made everyone move a little slower, except for the carnival workers who had long since adapted to the rhythm of endless festivals across small-town America. At the far end of the midway stood Jake Morrison's shooting gallery, a weathered wooden structure that had seen better days. Painted targets of ducks, rabbits, and bullseyes lined the back wall, many showing the wear of countless pellets over the years. Jake had been running this booth for nearly 2 decades, traveling from town to town with the same carnival crew, watching the same hopeful faces try to win oversized stuffed animals for their sweethearts. The afternoon crowd was typical for a Saturday. Teenage boys flexed their muscles while attempting to impress their girlfriends, missing shot after shot with the deliberately misaligned air rifles. Fathers tried to show off for their children, only to walk away empty-handed and slightly embarrassed. Jake had seen it all before. The guns were legal but intentionally difficult to use accurately, ensuring that most customers would leave without a prize while still having enough fun to recommend the experience to others. "Step right up. Test your marksmanship," Jake called out in his practiced carnival barker voice. 3 shots for $5. Hit all 3 moving targets and win any prize on the wall. His voice carried the confident tone of someone who knew the odds were heavily in his favor. The moving targets were Jake's newest addition to the gallery. 3 mechanical ducks that moved along a wire track at varying speeds, powered by an old motor that created an unpredictable jerky motion. In the 6 months since he had installed them, only 2 people had managed to hit all 3 targets, and both had been obvious military veterans with steady hands and patient eyes. As the afternoon wore on, Jake noticed the usual pattern. Young men would step up confidently, pay their $5 and fire 3 quick shots in rapid succession. The moving targets would continue their mechanical dance, untouched and mocking. Occasionally someone would graze 1 target, earning polite applause from gathered onlookers, but hitting all 3 seemed nearly impossible for the average fairgoer. The crowd around the shooting gallery began to grow as word spread about the challenge. People love to watch others attempt difficult tasks, especially when failure seems inevitable. Children pressed against the counter, wide-eyed with wonder at the moving targets. Parents stood behind them, calculating whether the potential prize was worth the likely disappointment. Among the gathering crowd, a woman stood quietly at the back. She appeared to be in her 40s, with graying hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, and wearing faded jeans with a plain blue shirt. Nothing about her appearance suggested any particular skill with firearms. She watched the proceedings with calm, patient eyes, observing each shooter's technique and the movement pattern of the mechanical ducks. Her name was Sarah Chen, though nobody at the fair knew this. She had come to the carnival alone, something she rarely did since her husband's death 3 years earlier. The afternoon had been an attempt to reconnect with simple pleasures, to find some joy in the midst of a life that had become too quiet and predictable. She had wandered through the fairgrounds without purpose, eating funnel cake and watching children play games she remembered from her own youth. Sarah had noticed the shooting gallery early in her visit, but had continued walking. Guns brought back memories she preferred to keep buried. Her late husband David had been a shooting instructor before his cancer diagnosis, and they had spent countless weekends at the range together. She had been naturally gifted, with steady hands and exceptional depth perception that made her a formidable marksman. But after David's death, she had sold his gun collection and avoided anything that reminded her of their shared passion. Now, watching the frustrated attempts of carnival goers, Sarah found herself analyzing the mechanical movement of the targets. Her trained eye could see the pattern that others missed. The ducks moved in a predictable sequence with timing that could be calculated and anticipated. The jerky motion that seemed random actually followed a specific rhythm, probably due to a worn gear in the motor assembly. She moved closer to the front of the crowd, not with any intention of participating, but drawn by professional curiosity. Jake noticed her approach and automatically launched into his sales pitch, but something in her steady gaze made him pause. Most people looked at the targets with hope or frustration. This woman looked at them with the analytical eye of someone who understood exactly what she was seeing. "Difficult shot," Sarah said quietly, more to herself than to Jake. "Nearly impossible," Jake replied with a grin. "Been running this booth for 20 years. And I can count on one hand the number of people who've hit all three moving targets. Sarah nodded thoughtfully, continuing to watch the mechanical ducks complete their endless journey along the wire track. She could feel the familiar itch in her trigger finger, the muscle memory of countless hours spent perfecting her aim under David's patient instruction. Part of her wanted to walk away, to maintain the careful distance she had built between herself and everything that reminded her of him. But another part of her, a part that had been sleeping for 3 years, began to stir with interest. The technical challenge appealed to her analytical mind. The moving targets weren't random at all, they were a puzzle waiting to be solved. And despite her reluctance to admit it, she missed the precise satisfaction that came with a perfect shot. The crowd continued to grow as more attempts ended in failure. Jake's prizes remained safely on their hooks, mocking the frustrated shooters who walked away shaking their heads. The moving targets seemed to develop personalities of their own. 3 mechanical ducks that had achieved an almost supernatural ability to dodge bullets. Sarah remained at the edge of the crowd, watching and calculating, while wrestling with memories and possibilities she thought she had left behind forever. The crowd around Jake's shooting gallery had grown considerably by late afternoon. Word was spreading throughout the fairground about the impossible moving targets, drawing curious onlookers and confident challengers alike. A line of eager participants stretched back from the booth, each person convinced they would be the one to finally conquer the mechanical ducks. Sarah watched from her position at the side of the growing crowd as attempt after attempt ended in failure. A construction worker with massive forearms missed all 3 targets despite his confident swagger. A teenager who claimed to be on his high school shooting team managed to graze 1 duck, but missed the other 2 completely. Even a middle-aged man who announced he was a weekend hunter walked away empty-handed, muttering about rigged carnival games. With each failed attempt, Jake's confidence grew more visible. He had perfected the art of sympathetic encouragement while secretly celebrating another $5 victory. The moving targets had more than paid for themselves in just 6 months, turning his modest shooting gallery into one of the most profitable attractions on the Midway. "Don't feel bad," Jake consoled a disappointed father who had just missed his 3rd shot. "These moving targets are designed to challenge even experienced shooters. The motion is completely unpredictable." Sarah almost smiled at this comment. The motion was actually quite predictable once you understood the mechanical timing involved. The 3 ducks moved along their wire track in a pattern that repeated every 47 seconds. She had been timing it with her watch for the past hour, noting how the worn motor created specific hesitations and accelerations. The first duck moved at a steady pace until it reached the halfway point, where a worn gear caused it to stutter for exactly 2 seconds before continuing. The second duck traveled faster, but paused for 3 seconds at each end of its track. The third duck moved in an erratic pattern that seemed random, but actually followed a precise sequence, based on the motor's irregular timing. Sarah had learned pattern recognition from David during their early days at the shooting range. "Everything mechanical has a rhythm," he used to say. "Find the rhythm, and you control the shot." It was advice that had helped her become one of the best recreational shooters in their county, winning local competitions and earning respect from seasoned marksmen who initially dismissed her as a beginner. As the afternoon progressed, Sarah found herself increasingly drawn into the technical challenge. She began moving closer to the front of the crowd, studying the targets from different angles and noting how the lighting affected visibility at various positions along their track. The carnival lights would turn on soon as evening approached, which would change the shooting conditions significantly. A group of college students took their turn at the booth, approaching the challenge with loud bravado and good-natured competition. They had clearly been drinking beer at the carnival, which explained their overconfidence and poor coordination. The first student fired 3 rapid shots that didn't come close to any target. His friends laughed and offered unwanted advice for the next attempt. "You're jerking the trigger," one of them shouted. "Squeeze it smooth and slow." Sarah winced at the amateur coaching. Trigger control was important, but with moving targets, timing was everything. The students were firing as soon as they raised the rifle, without taking time to observe the movement pattern or calculate the proper lead time for their shots. The second student tried a different approach, taking careful aim at the first duck and following it with his rifle sight. This technique worked better for stationary targets, but with moving targets, it guaranteed missing. By the time the brain processed the target's position and commanded the finger to fire, The duck had already moved to a different location. Sarah remembered David's patient instruction about shooting moving targets. Don't chase the target with your sight, he had taught her. Pick a point where the target will be, and fire when it reaches that point. It required understanding the target's speed and direction, then calculating the exact moment to pull the trigger. The third student actually managed to hit one of the moving ducks, earning cheers from his friends and a congratulatory handshake from Jake. It was clearly a lucky shot rather than skillful marksmanship, but the success energized the crowd and encouraged more people to try their luck. As evening approached, the carnival lights began to flicker on, changing the atmosphere of the fairground from bright afternoon sunshine to the magical glow of nighttime entertainment. The shooting gallery took on a different character under the artificial lighting, with shadows dancing across the targets and creating new visual challenges for potential marksmen. Sarah noticed how the changing light conditions affected the visibility of the moving targets. The mechanical ducks were painted in bright colors that showed clearly against the backdrop during daylight, but under the carnival lights, they became more difficult to track accurately. Most shooters would instinctively compensate by aiming more carefully, which would actually make them less accurate with moving targets. The crowd around the shooting gallery continued to grow as more people heard about the challenging moving targets. Families gathered to watch, children pressed against the counter with wide eyes, and teenagers dated by attempting to win prizes for their girlfriends. The atmosphere was festive and encouraging, with spectators cheering for each attempt and offering consolation when shots went wide. Jake was clearly enjoying his evening. The moving targets had exceeded his expectations for both entertainment value and profitability. He estimated that he had collected over $200 in entry fees throughout the afternoon, while giving away only one small stuffed animal to the lucky college student who had managed to hit a single duck. "Step right up," Jake called out, as the line of challengers continued to grow. 3 shots for $5. Hit all 3 moving targets and win any prize on the wall. Who thinks they can master the impossible shot? Sarah found herself standing directly behind the current group of participants. She was close enough to smell the gun oil on the rifles and hear the mechanical whirring of the target motor. Her hands tingled with muscle memory, remembering the weight of a rifle and the precise finger placement required for accurate shooting. Part of her wanted to turn and walk away, to maintain the emotional distance she had carefully constructed over the past 3 years. But another part of her, a competitive spirit that David had awakened and nurtured, was fully engaged by the technical challenge before her. The moving targets weren't impossible at all. They were simply a puzzle that required the right combination of observation, timing, and skill to solve. The carnival lights cast dancing shadows across the shooting gallery as evening settled over the fairground. The crowd had grown larger and more boisterous, with people calling out encouragement and advice to each shooter, who stepped up to face the challenge of the moving targets. Jake Morrison worked the crowd like a seasoned performer, building excitement and maintaining the festive atmosphere that kept customers coming back for more attempts. Sarah Chen found herself pressed closer to the front of the gathering crowd, close enough to observe every detail of the shooting gallery setup. The air rifles were older models, probably 177 caliber pneumatic guns that Jake had modified slightly to reduce their accuracy without making them completely unusable. The sights were deliberately misaligned, and the trigger pull had been adjusted to be heavier than normal, making precise shooting more difficult for casual users. These were standard carnival practices that Sarah recognized from her years of experience with firearms. The modifications were subtle enough that most people wouldn't notice them, but they created just enough difficulty to stack the odds in favor of the house. However, an experienced shooter who understood these limitations could compensate for them with proper technique and patience. She watched as a young military serviceman in civilian clothes approached the booth. His bearing and careful observation of the targets before paying his $5 marked him as someone with genuine shooting experience. Unlike the previous customers who had fired quickly and impulsively, this man took time to study the movement pattern of the mechanical ducks. "Take your time," Jake said, though Sarah detected a slight nervousness in his voice. Experience had taught him to recognize potentially skilled shooters, and this customer had all the signs of someone who might actually succeed. The serviceman raised the rifle deliberately, testing its weight and balance. He dry-fired at once to get a feel for the trigger pull, then spent nearly a minute observing the movement pattern of the targets, Sarah approved of his methodical approach, which reminded her of David's patient teaching style. When the serviceman finally took his first shot, it was with calculated precision. The pellet struck the first duck squarely in the center, producing a satisfying metallic ping that drew cheers from the watching crowd. His second shot was equally accurate, hitting the second duck as it paused at the end of its track. The crowd grew silent as he prepared for his final shot. The third duck was the most challenging target, with its erratic movement pattern that seemed to defy prediction. The serviceman followed it with his sight for several seconds, calculating its timing and speed. When he fired, the pellet passed just inches behind the duck, missing by the narrowest of margins. "So close," Jake exclaimed with genuine relief masked as disappointment. "That was some excellent shooting. You nearly had all three." The serviceman nodded graciously and walked away, accepting the consolation prize of a small stuffed animal. His near success had energized the crowd, proving that hitting all three targets was possible while maintaining the challenge that kept people trying. Sarah had watched the entire sequence with professional interest. The serviceman's technique had been sound, but he had made one critical error in calculating the timing of the third duck. The erratic movement wasn't random at all. It followed a specific pattern based on the motor's irregular speed variations. She had been studying this pattern for over an hour and had identified the precise rhythm that governed the duck's seemingly unpredictable motion. As more customers stepped up to try their luck, Sarah moved to a position where she could observe the rifles more closely. She needed to understand exactly how Jake had modified them in order to compensate for their deliberate inaccuracy. The sights were clearly off-center, probably adjusted to shoot slightly low and to the left. The trigger pull was heavy and had a long take-up before reaching the breaking point. These modifications would frustrate casual shooters who expected the rifles to perform like properly zeroed weapons. But for someone who understood the adjustments, it would be possible to compensate by adjusting aim point and trigger technique accordingly. Sarah had dealt with poorly maintained rifles before during her competition days, when equipment problems had forced her to adapt quickly to changing conditions. The crowd around the shooting gallery continued to grow as word spread about the challenging moving targets. Parents lifted children onto their shoulders to get better views. Teenagers gathered in excited groups discussing strategy, and couples held hands while watching the ongoing competition. The festive atmosphere was infectious, drawing even reluctant participants into the excitement. Jake was clearly in his element, working the crowd with practiced showmanship while secretly calculating his growing profits. The moving targets had transformed his modest shooting gallery into one of the most popular attractions at the carnival. He estimated that he was averaging one successful customer for every 40 attempts, which provided excellent profit margins while maintaining enough hope to keep people trying. "Who's ready to take on the impossible challenge?" Jake called out to the gathered crowd. 3 moving targets, 3 shots, 1 chance to prove your marksmanship skills. Step right up and test your abilities against the most challenging shot in the carnival. Sarah felt her pulse quicken as Jake's eyes swept across the crowd, briefly making contact with her own. For a moment, she thought he might call her forward specifically, recognizing something in her intense observation that suggested genuine interest rather than casual curiosity. But Jake moved on to work other potential customers, and Sarah remained safely anonymous in the crowd. She was grateful for the temporary reprieve, as she wasn't entirely certain what she would do if directly challenged to attempt the shot. Part of her wanted to prove that the targets weren't impossible, while another part preferred to maintain her distance from anything that reminded her too strongly of David and their shared passion for precision shooting. The evening air carried the mingled scents of carnival food, machine oil, and excitement. Children ran between the booths with sticky fingers and bright smiles. Parents followed with patient expressions and slowly emptying wallets, and teenagers navigated the complex social dynamics that made every carnival interaction feel monumentally important. Sarah found herself caught between her analytical fascination with the technical challenge and her emotional reluctance to engage with anything that might resurrect painful memories. The moving targets had captured her professional interest completely, but stepping forward to actually attempt the shot would cross a line she had carefully maintained for 3 years. As she watched another frustrated customer walk away empty-handed, Sarah made her decision. She would continue observing for a few more minutes, satisfying her curiosity about the mechanical timing and shooting conditions. Then she would leave the carnival and return to her quiet, predictable life, carrying with her the satisfaction of having solved the puzzle without needing to prove her solution publicly. As the evening progressed, the atmosphere around Jake's shooting gallery became increasingly electric. The near miss by the military serviceman had proven that hitting all 3 moving targets was possible, igniting hope in the growing crowd of spectators. More people were willing to pay $5 for their chance at glory, and the line of eager participants stretched longer than it had all day. Sarah remained at the edge of the crowd, continuing her careful observation of the mechanical targets while wrestling with her own internal conflict. She had solved the puzzle completely now, understanding not only the movement patterns of each duck but also the specific modifications Jake had made to his rifles. The challenge that seemed impossible to other customers was actually quite manageable for someone with her background and analytical approach. The first duck completed its cycle every 47 seconds, with a predictable stutter at the halfway point. The second duck moved faster but paused for exactly 3 seconds at each end of its track. The third duck followed a pattern that repeated every 2 minutes and 15 seconds, its apparently erratic motion controlled by worn gears that created specific hesitations and accelerations. More importantly, Sarah had identified the optimal shooting position. Most customers stood directly in front of the booth, but the lighting and angle from that position created unnecessary challenges. A position slightly to the left would provide better visibility and easier target acquisition, while accounting for the rifle's deliberate misalignment. As she calculated these variables, Sarah became aware of a commotion near the front of the crowd. A group of young men in their 20s had arrived, clearly having spent considerable time at the beer tent before discovering the shooting gallery. Their loud voices and aggressive posturing were disrupting the family-friendly atmosphere that Jake worked hard to maintain. "This is bull," one of them declared, after missing all 3 targets. "These guns are rigged. Nobody could hit those things." Jake handled the complaint with diplomatic professionalism, explaining that the targets were challenging but fair, and offering to let the customer try again at a discount. But the young man's friends were becoming increasingly belligerent, attracting unwanted attention and making other customers uncomfortable. "My buddy here was in the army," another member of the group announced loudly. "If he can't hit them, nobody can. This whole game is a scam." Sarah watched the situation develop with growing concern. The group's behavior was escalating, and she could see families with young children beginning to move away from the shooting gallery. Jake was trying to diffuse the tension, but his diplomatic approach wasn't working with customers who had consumed too much alcohol and lost too much money. The situation reached a tipping point when one of the young men grabbed a rifle without paying and attempted to fire it at the targets. Jake quickly intervened, firmly but politely taking the weapon away and asking the group to leave. This reasonable response was met with angry accusations and threats that made other customers visibly nervous. "You can't kick us out," the ringleader shouted. "We paid our money like everyone else. These games are illegal anyway. The whole carnival is probably crooked." Sarah felt her protective instincts engage as she watched Jake handle the confrontation with remarkable patience. She had seen similar situations during her competition days, when alcohol and disappointment combined to create aggressive behavior at shooting events. The carnival worker was doing his best to maintain order, but he was outnumbered and clearly concerned about the escalating situation. The crowd around the shooting gallery was beginning to disperse as parents led their children away from the confrontation. The festive atmosphere that had built throughout the evening was quickly evaporating, replaced by tension and uncertainty. Jake's profitable night was turning into a potential disaster that could affect his reputation and future business. Without fully realizing what she was doing, Sarah found herself moving forward through the crowd. Her years of competition shooting had taught her to remain calm under pressure, and her natural sense of justice was offended by the group's bullying behavior towards someone who was simply trying to make an honest living. "Excuse me," she said quietly as she approached the confrontation. Her voice was calm, but carried an authority that made everyone pause and look at her. The ringleader of the troublesome group turned toward her with an expression of surprise mixed with condescension. "What do you want, lady? This doesn't concern you." "Actually, it does," Sarah replied steadily. "You're disrupting everyone's enjoyment of the carnival with your behavior. These people just want to have fun with their families. Mind your own business, another member of the group snapped. Unless you think you can hit those stupid targets yourself. The challenge hung in the air like a physical presence. Sarah felt every eye in the remaining crowd focus on her, waiting to see how she would respond. Jake looked at her with curious hope, recognizing that her intervention might provide a way to resolve the situation peacefully. Sarah glanced at the moving targets, then back at the group of young men who were now watching her with amused skepticism. She had intended only to diffuse the confrontation, not to put herself in the spotlight. But the direct challenge to her abilities had awakened the competitive spirit that David had nurtured during their years together. "How much are you willing to bet that I can't?" she asked quietly. The question surprised everyone, including Sarah herself. She hadn't planned to issue a counter-challenge, but something about the group's arrogant certainty had triggered her competitive instincts. The same instincts that had driven her to excel in local shooting competitions and earn respect from seasoned marksmen who initially underestimated her abilities. The ringleader laughed and looked around at his friends for support. "You? Hit all 3 moving targets? Lady, you don't look like you've ever held a gun in your life." $50 says I can hit all 3 targets with 3 shots, Sarah said, her voice remaining calm despite the rapid beating of her heart. The crowd murmured with excitement at this unexpected development. Jake looked at Sarah with new interest, recognizing the confidence in her voice despite her unassuming appearance. The troublesome group exchanged glances, clearly tempted by what seemed like easy money. "You're serious?" the ringleader asked, his tone shifting from mockery to genuine interest. "Completely serious," Sarah confirmed. $50. I hit all 3 moving targets, you pay up and leave quietly. I miss, you get $50 and I'll buy everyone a round of beer. The terms were clear and attractive to young men who had been drinking and losing money all evening. They huddled briefly to discuss the proposition, then turned back to Sarah with confident grins. "You got yourself a bet, lady," the ringleader announced. "This is the easiest $50 we've made all night." The crowd around Jake's shooting gallery had transformed completely in the span of a few minutes. What had begun as a confrontation between drunk customers and a patient carnival worker had evolved into an impromptu competition that drew spectators from across the fairground. Word was spreading quickly that a middle-aged woman had challenged a group of troublemakers to a $50 bet involving the impossible moving targets. Sarah stood at the counter of the shooting gallery, acutely aware of the dozens of eyes focused on her. The weight of expectation was familiar from her competition days, but this situation felt different. She wasn't shooting for trophies or personal satisfaction anymore. She was shooting to defend the integrity of an honest business owner and to prove that bullying behavior wouldn't be tolerated. Jake handed her the entry fee rifle with obvious nervousness. His evening had gone from profitable routine to potential disaster, to unexpected opportunity in the space of 10 minutes. He wasn't entirely sure what to make of the quiet woman who had stepped forward to defend his business, but her calm confidence suggested she might know more about shooting than her appearance indicated. "Take your time," Jake said quietly, as Sarah accepted the rifle. "These rifles shoot a little low and to the left, and the trigger pull is heavier than normal." Sarah nodded her appreciation for the honest information. Most carnival operators would have remained silent about their equipment modifications, hoping to maintain every possible advantage. Jake's willingness to provide helpful guidance confirmed her initial impression that he was running an honest operation, despite the challenging targets. She examined the rifle carefully, testing its weight and balance while the crowd watched with fascination. The weapon was heavier than modern sporting rifles, with iron sights that had indeed been deliberately misaligned. The stock showed wear from thousands of previous users, and the barrel had accumulated a thin coating of dirt and gun oil. Sarah worked the action several times to get a feel for the mechanism, then dry-fired the rifle to understand the trigger characteristics. The pull was definitely heavy, probably 8 or 9 pounds instead of the 2 or 3 pounds she was accustomed to from properly adjusted competition rifles. The trigger also had considerable take-up before reaching the breaking point, which would throw off most casual shooters. "Just get it over with," one of the young men called out impatiently. "We've got beer to buy with your $50. Sarah ignored the taunting and moved to her preferred shooting position, slightly to the left of the booth's center line. The adjustment drew questioning looks from some spectators who expected her to shoot from the traditional position directly in front of the targets, but Sarah had calculated that the angle would provide better visibility and compensate for the rifle's misalignment. She spent several minutes observing the movement patterns of the three mechanical ducks, confirming the timing calculations she had made during her hour of careful observation. The first duck moved steadily until its halfway point stutter. The second duck paused predictably at each end of its track, and the third duck followed its complex but repetitive pattern, governed by the worn motor gears. The crowd grew increasingly quiet as Sarah continued her preparation. Her methodical approach was unlike anything most spectators had witnessed from previous shooters, who typically fired quickly and impulsively. Even the troublesome group of young men began to show signs of uncertainty as they observed her professional demeanor. "She looks like she actually knows what she's doing," one of them whispered to his companions, loud enough for others to hear. Sarah was ready. She had identified the optimal sequence for engaging the targets, calculated the precise timing required for each shot, and compensated for the rifle's known deficiencies. More importantly, she had found the mental focus that had served her well during competition shooting, blocking out external distractions and concentrating entirely on the technical challenge ahead. The first target would be the middle duck, which paused for 3 seconds at the right end of its track. Sarah raised the rifle and acquired the target through the misaligned sights, adjusting her aim point to compensate for the known deviation. When the duck reached its pause point, she squeezed the trigger with steady pressure, following through with her shot as David had taught her years earlier. The pellet struck the mechanical duck with a clear metallic ping that carried across the suddenly silent fairground. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, but Sarah remained focused on her next target. One successful shot proved nothing except that she understood basic marksmanship principles. The real challenge lay in maintaining accuracy for the remaining 2 shots. The second target was the steady-moving duck, with the predictable stutter at its halfway point. Sarah tracked the target with her sight, calculating the exact moment when the mechanical hesitation would occur. The timing had to be perfect, as the duck would be stationary for only 2 seconds before resuming its movement. When the duck reached its stutter point, Sarah was ready. Her second shot produced another satisfying metallic ping, confirming that her calculations were accurate and her technique was sound. The crowd's excitement grew more intense, with people calling out encouragement and pressing closer to witness the final shot. The troublesome group of young men no longer looked confident about their easy $50. Their expressions had shifted from amused condescension to genuine concern, as they realized they might have seriously underestimated their opponent. The woman they had dismissed as a harmless middle-aged carnival visitor was demonstrating skills that surpassed anything they had witnessed all evening. Sarah prepared for her final shot, knowing that this target represented the greatest challenge. The third duck's erratic movement pattern had frustrated every previous shooter, including the experienced military serviceman who had come so close to success. The timing was critical, requiring precise calculation and flawless execution. She followed the duck through several complete cycles, confirming her understanding of its complex pattern. When the moment was right, when all her calculations aligned perfectly, Sarah squeezed the trigger for the third time. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, and the pellet flew toward its target with deadly accuracy. The third metallic ping seemed to echo longer than the first 2, followed by a moment of stunned silence as the crowd processed what they had just witnessed. Then the fairground exploded with cheers, applause, and amazed laughter, as spectators realized they had seen something truly extraordinary. The explosion of cheers and applause that followed Sarah's third successful shot seemed to echo across the entire fairground. Word of her incredible achievement spread like wildfire, drawing curious spectators from every corner of the carnival. Within minutes, the shooting gallery was surrounded by hundreds of people, all eager to see the woman who had accomplished what everyone believed was impossible. Sarah stood at the counter, still holding the smoking rifle, as the reality of what she had just done began to sink in. The mechanical ducks continued their endless journey along their wire tracks, but they no longer seemed intimidating or impossible. They were simply machinery following predictable patterns, no different from the targets she had mastered during her years of competition shooting with David. Jake Morrison stared at her with a mixture of amazement and respect that bordered on reverence. In 20 years of running carnival shooting galleries, he had never witnessed such precise marksmanship under pressure. The 3 consecutive hits weren't lucky shots or accidental success. They were the result of skill, calculation, and experience. that went far beyond anything he had expected from a casual carnival visitor. That was absolutely incredible, Jake said as he extended his hand to Sarah. I've seen maybe 2 people hit all 3 targets since I installed them 6 months ago, and neither of them made it look as easy as you just did. Where did you learn to shoot like that? Sarah accepted the handshake while considering how to answer the question. The story of her shooting background was complicated by memories of David and their shared passion for precision marksmanship. She wasn't ready to share those personal details with strangers, even friendly ones who had just witnessed her moment of triumph. I used to do some competitive shooting, she said simply, hoping to satisfy curiosity without inviting too many follow-up questions. The troublesome group of young men approached the counter with obvious reluctance, their earlier confidence and aggression completely deflated by Sarah's demonstration of superior skill. The ringleader reached into his wallet and counted out $50 in crumpled bills, placing them on the counter with visible irritation. Guess we underestimated you, he mumbled, avoiding eye contact with Sarah while his friends shifted uncomfortably behind him. Everyone makes mistakes, Sarah replied graciously. The important thing is learning from them. The group departed without further incident, their departure met with scattered applause from spectators who had witnessed their earlier bullying behavior. Their exit removed the last trace of tension from the evening, allowing the crowd to focus entirely on celebrating Sarah's remarkable achievement. Jake selected the largest prize from his collection, an enormous stuffed bear that normally required hitting multiple targets over several attempts to win. He presented it to Sarah with a flourish that drew renewed cheers from the watching crowd. This doesn't even begin to cover what you deserve, Jake said as he handed over the prize. You didn't just win a bet tonight. You saved my business from a bad situation and gave everyone here a memory they'll never forget. Sarah accepted the oversized bear with genuine appreciation, though she couldn't help smiling at the thought of carrying such an enormous prize through the fairground. The stuffed animal was nearly as tall as she was, with soft brown fur and friendly button eyes that seemed to reflect the joy of the surrounding crowd. The spectators pressed closer, eager to congratulate Sarah and ask questions about her shooting technique. Children stared at her with wide-eyed wonder. Teenagers peppered her with questions about how she had learned such incredible skills, and adults shook their heads in amazement at what they had witnessed. How did you know the timing? A curious father asked. Those ducks move so unpredictably. Everything mechanical has a pattern, Sarah explained, unconsciously echoing David's words from years earlier. You just have to watch long enough to figure out what it is. A teenage boy who had unsuccessfully attempted the targets earlier in the evening looked at her with obvious admiration. Could you teach me to shoot like that? Sarah felt a familiar warmth at the question, remembering how David had patiently guided her through the fundamentals of marksmanship during their early days together. Teaching others had always been one of his greatest pleasures, and she had occasionally helped him with beginning students at their local shooting range. The most important thing is patience, she told the teenager. Most people try to rush their shots. Take time to understand what you're shooting at before you pull the trigger. As the crowd continued to celebrate and ask questions, Sarah became aware of how much she had missed this feeling of accomplishment and recognition. The past 3 years had been characterized by isolation and withdrawal from activities that reminded her of David. But standing here surrounded by appreciative spectators, she remembered why she had fallen in love with precision shooting in the first place. The technical challenge, the requirement for absolute focus, the satisfaction of perfect execution, all these elements had drawn her to competitive shooting long before she met David. He had enhanced and guided her natural abilities, but the fundamental passion had been her own. Tonight's success reminded her that those abilities hadn't disappeared with his death. They had simply been sleeping. Jake was fielding questions from other carnival workers who had heard about the incredible shooting display and come to witness the aftermath. Several of them expressed disbelief that anyone could hit all 3 moving targets, forcing Jake to repeatedly confirm that he had witnessed the entire sequence himself. She made it look easy, Jake told his colleagues. 3 shots, 3 hits, like she was shooting at stationary targets. I've never seen anything like it. The carnival lights continued to dance across the fairground as the evening progressed, but the shooting gallery remained the center of attention. Other booths and rides were experiencing reduced traffic as people continued to gather around Sarah, hoping to hear more about her remarkable achievement or possibly witness additional demonstrations of her skill. Sarah began to feel overwhelmed by the constant attention and questions. The emotional impact of returning to competitive shooting, even briefly, was more intense than she had anticipated. She needed time to process what had happened, and what it might mean for her future relationship with the activities she had shared with David. "I should probably head home," she announced, to Jake and the surrounding crowd. "Thank you all for such a wonderful evening." The crowd applauded her again as she prepared to leave, many people calling out final congratulations and expressions of admiration. Sarah clutched her enormous stuffed bear and made her way through the appreciative spectators, feeling both exhausted and exhilarated by the unexpected turn her quiet evening had taken. Sarah drove home through the quiet streets with the enormous stuffed bear secured in her passenger seat, its friendly button eyes reflecting the occasional streetlight. The fairground noise and excitement felt like a dream now, replaced by the familiar silence of her evening routine. But something fundamental had changed during those few minutes at the shooting gallery, something that would make it impossible to return completely to her previous life of careful isolation. The house felt different when she unlocked the front door and stepped inside. For 3 years, it had been a refuge from memories and reminders of her life with David. Tonight, it felt more like a shrine to avoidance, filled with spaces where his presence had been carefully erased rather than lovingly preserved. The shooting trophies and photographs from their competition days remained boxed in the basement, along with everything else that connected her to their shared passion. Sarah placed the stuffed bear on the living room couch and sat beside it, running her fingers through its soft fur while reflecting on the evening's events. The physical act of shooting had felt as natural as breathing, her body remembering skills and reflexes that hadn't been used in years. But more importantly, the mental focus and competitive satisfaction had reminded her of who she used to be before grief transformed her into someone who avoided challenges rather than embracing them. The phone rang, interrupting her contemplation. Sarah almost ignored it, as she typically did with evening calls from unknown numbers. But something made her answer, perhaps the same impulse that had driven her to accept the challenge at the carnival. "Is this Sarah Chen?" asked an unfamiliar male voice. "Yes, who is this?" "My name is Mike Rodriguez. I run the county shooting club where you and your husband used to compete. I heard about what happened at the carnival tonight and I wanted to reach out." Sarah felt a mixture of surprise and wariness. She had avoided contact with anyone from their old shooting community, concerned that such connections would make moving forward more difficult. But Mike's voice carried genuine warmth and respect, rather than the awkward sympathy she had come to dread. "How did you hear about tonight?" she asked. "Word travels fast in a small community. Jake Morrison is actually a friend of mine, and he called to tell me about your incredible shooting display. He wanted to know if I knew who you were, since he thought you might have competition experience." Sarah remembered Mike as a kind and supportive presence during her competitive shooting days. He had always encouraged her participation in matches and had been particularly helpful during her transition from recreational shooting to serious competition. His call tonight felt like reconnection with a positive part of her past rather than an unwelcome intrusion. "I haven't shot competitively in 3 years," Sarah said carefully. "I know, and I understand why. David's death was a tremendous loss for our entire shooting community. He was not only an excellent marksman, but a wonderful teacher and mentor to newer shooters." The mention of David's name brought the familiar ache, but it was softer now, mixed with pride rather than overwhelming by pure grief. Tonight's success had reminded Sarah that her husband's legacy included the skills and confidence he had helped her develop, not just the sorrow of his absence. "What you did tonight was remarkable," Mike continued. "Jake said it was the most impressive display of marksmanship he's ever witnessed. The entire community is talking about it." "It was just a carnival game," Sarah protested, though she knew that minimizing her achievement was unnecessary humility. "No, it was much more than that. You demonstrated skills under pressure that most competitive shooters would envy. More importantly, you stood up for someone who needed help and proved that bullying behavior won't be tolerated." Sarah felt a warmth spreading through her chest at Mike's words. She had focused so much on the technical aspects of her shooting performance that she hadn't fully appreciated the broader significance of her actions. Standing up to the troublesome group had felt like a natural response to injustice, but it represented something larger about the person she wanted to be. "We're hosting a memorial match next month in honor of shooters we've lost over the years," Mike said carefully. "David will be one of the people we're remembering. I know this might be difficult, but we'd love to have you participate if you're interested. The invitation hung in the air as Sarah considered its implications. Returning to competitive shooting would mean confronting memories and emotions she had spent 3 years avoiding. But tonight's experience had shown her that those memories included joy and accomplishment as well as loss. "I'll think about it," Sarah said finally. "That's all I can ask. Whether you decide to compete or not, you should know that David would be incredibly proud of what you accomplished tonight. You honored his memory and his teaching in the best possible way." After ending the call, Sarah sat in her quiet living room with the stuffed bear beside her, contemplating the unexpected turn her life had taken. The woman who had entered the carnival that afternoon, seeking simple distraction, had been transformed by a few minutes of precision shooting into someone who was once again connected to her community and her own abilities. She thought about David and how he would have reacted to tonight's events. He would have been proud of her technical skill, certainly, but he would have been even more proud of her willingness to help someone in need and stand up for what was right. Those had always been the values that mattered most to him, far beyond any shooting trophies or competition victories. Sarah made her decision. She walked to the basement and retrieved the boxes containing her shooting equipment and competition memorabilia. It was time to stop hiding from the past and start building a future that honored both her memories of David and her own potential for continued growth and achievement. The quiet house began to feel like home again as Sarah unpacked photographs and trophies, remembering victories and challenges that had shaped her into the shooter who could hit 3 moving targets instantly when it mattered most. The silent woman in the back had found her voice again, and she was ready to use it.